Ethan Carter drifted through the halls of Northwood High, a mere wisp of a figure overlooked amidst the bustling crowd, students surging past without so much as a glance. At 16, his height barely cleared 5 feet 5 inches, his complexion pale, almost see-through under the bright lights overhead, with heavy shadows beneath his eyes that gave him a look of constant fatigue. His distinct Irish brogue made his words sound peculiar to his American peers, and the hand-me-down clothes hung loosely, marking him as an outsider from the moment he arrived. It had been just under a month since Ethan and his grandfather had settled in this quiet Montana town, running from a history beyond the grasp of anyone at Northwood High. His grandfather was working long hours at the local sawmill, struggling to earn enough to support them in their small room above the antique shop. Ethan tried to remain unnoticed, only speaking when addressed directly, attempting to fade into the backdrop of high school life that seemed so distant from his own. But anonymity was out of reach when you were the only student who jumped at loud sounds, who ate every meal with the urgency of someone unsure of the next, and who moved with the guarded, deliberate steps of one who understood that attracting attention invited trouble. The first time Caleb Johnson took notice, Ethan was alone at the edge of the lunchroom, carefully eating his packed lunch while absorbed in a battered copy of The Hobbit. Caleb was everything Ethan wasn't: tall, muscular, possessing the effortless self-assurance that came from a life of privilege. He was the star quarterback on the football team, and his family owned the largest ranch in the county. When Caleb decided someone warranted his focus, it rarely ended well. "Hey, Paddy," Caleb yelled, using the nickname he had given Ethan on his first day. "Gonna finish that sandwich?" Ethan looked up slowly, his light green eyes briefly meeting Caleb's before returning to his book. He pushed the sandwich across the table without a word, hoping it would end there. But Caleb had no interest in the sandwich. He was interested in the reaction, the tightening of Ethan's shoulders, the almost imperceptible clenching of his jaw. Caleb had grown up getting whatever he wanted, and at this moment he craved amusement. "What's wrong, Paddy? Lost your voice?" Caleb laughed, and his friends, Dustin Price and Ryan Hayes, joined in. Dustin was nearly as large as Caleb, equally cruel, but less clever. Ryan was smaller, the kind of kid who followed bullies because it was safer than becoming their target. Ethan closed his book carefully, placed it in his backpack, and stood to leave. But Caleb wasn't finished with him yet. "Where you going, leprechaun? We're just getting acquainted." The way Caleb said leprechaun made it sound like an insult. Other students were starting to pay attention, turning to watch. Ethan felt the familiar anxiety in his chest, the old instincts kicking in. In another life, in another time, he would have already assessed escape routes, identified potential weapons, gauged the threat level of each opponent. But this wasn't that place, and he wasn't that person anymore. Or at least, he was trying not to be. "I have to get to class," Ethan said softly, his accent heavy with tension. "Have to get to class," Caleb mocked, exaggerating the vowels in a clumsy Irish accent. "Have to get to class, little leprechaun." The laughter from the surrounding tables was like a physical blow. Ethan's hand tightened on his backpack strap, and for a moment his eyes flashed with something sharp and dangerous. But he forced himself to turn away, to walk toward the exit with measured steps. That's when Dustin stuck out his foot. Ethan fell hard, his backpack flying open as he hit the floor. Books scattered across the linoleum, and his worn journal fell open, revealing pages filled with Gaelic script. The laughter grew louder, and someone started clapping. "Oops," Dustin said, grinning down at him. "Didn't see you there, Paddy." Ethan gathered his books in silence, his face burning with shame. As he reached for his journal, Caleb stepped on it, grinding his heel into the pages. "What's this, Paddy? Love letters to your shamrock?" The journal was the only thing Ethan had left from before, filled with his grandfather's stories and recipes from their homeland. Seeing it under Caleb's shoe sent a surge of rage through him, blurring his vision. His fingers twitched, his body trying to take over, but he couldn't, he wouldn't. His grandfather had made him promise. "Please," Ethan whispered, looking up at Caleb, "please, give me back my journal." The plea seemed to satisfy something in Caleb. He lifted his foot and stepped back, watching as Ethan carefully picked up the damaged journal and clutched it to his chest. "See you around, Paddy," Caleb said, his voice carrying a threat that made Ethan's blood run cold. The pattern was set that day. Caleb and his friends would find Ethan between classes, in the hallways, sometimes even in the restrooms. They would knock his books from his hands, make comments about his accent, call him Paddy, Leprechaun, or Greenhorn. They would ask him if he had found his pot of gold, if he kissed the Blarney Stone, if he was going to fight them. Ethan endured it all in silence. He would pick up the mess they made, gather the items they scattered, and continue without a word of complaint. He never fought back, never raised his voice, never even looked them in the eye for more than a moment. The other students watched with the detached interest usually reserved for a nature documentary. Some felt sorry for the quiet Irish kid, but not enough to intervene. Getting involved meant becoming a target, and everyone knew it was better to be a bystander than a victim. Mrs. Davies, his history teacher, noticed the increasingly frequent bruises on his arms, the way he flinched when anyone raised their voice. She called him aside after class one day, her voice soft with concern. "Ethan, is everything all right at home? Are you finding it hard to adjust to the school?" He looked at her with those pale, ancient eyes and nodded slowly. "Everything is fine, Mrs. Davies. Thank you for asking." She wanted to push, wanted to help, but something in his voice warned her off. Something that suggested he had learned long ago that adults couldn't always be trusted to protect you. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Ethan was walking to his locker after the final bell, looking forward to the weekend, to 2 days of blessed peace. But Caleb and his gang were waiting, and they had brought reinforcements. "Hey, Paddy!" Caleb called out, his voice echoing in the nearly empty hallway. "We were just talking about you." Ethan stopped, but didn't turn around. He could hear them approaching, could count their footsteps, could smell the mixture of cologne and sweat that seemed to surround them. "We were wondering," Dustin said, blocking Ethan's path to the exit, "if it's true what they say about the Irish and luck." "Yeah," Ryan chimed in, emboldened by the presence of the older boys. "I heard you guys are always lucky or something. Is that true, Paddy?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He tried to step around Dustin, but the larger boy blocked him again. "Come on, Paddy," Caleb said, his voice taking on a dangerous tone. "We're just curious. You never talk to anyone, never tell us anything about yourself. We're trying to be friendly here." "I want to go home," Ethan said quietly. "Home?" Caleb laughed. "You mean back to Ireland?" "Yeah, we all want that too. But since you're stuck here with us Americans, you might as well answer our questions." The group had grown, other students drawn by the promise of a spectacle. Someone had their phone out, recording. Ethan could see himself as they saw him, small, foreign, helpless. The familiar rage was building, but he suppressed it as his grandfather had taught him. "Control your temper, lad," he would say, using his childhood nickname. "Anger is what drove us from our home. Anger is what we left behind." But as Ethan stood there, surrounded by teenagers who saw him as nothing more than entertainment, he could feel his temper stirring within him, the part of him that had learned to survive in places where mercy was a weakness and weakness meant death. "I heard," Caleb continued, his voice ringing clearly through the hallway, "that your dad was some kind of terrorist. That's why you're here, right? Your family was kicked out of Ireland?" The words struck Ethan like physical blows. His father had been many things, but a terrorist wasn't one of them. He had been a dedicated peacekeeper who tried to protect his community, tried to stop the cycle of violence that tore apart families. That's what had gotten him killed, and what had sent Ethan and his grandfather fleeing across the ocean to this quiet Montana town. "My father was a good man," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "Sure he was," Caleb sneered. "That's why you're here instead of there, right? That's why you dress like a pauper and your grandfather works at that dirty sawmill?" The circle of students was growing, and Ethan could hear their whispers, their snickers. He could see some of them recording, capturing his humiliation for posterity. His hands were shaking, and he clenched them into fists to hide it. "You know what?" Caleb said, his eyes lighting up with an idea. "I think it's time we tested that Irish luck. What do you guys think?" The agreement was instant and enthusiastic. Before Ethan could react, strong hands grabbed his arms, and he found himself being dragged toward the back of the school. He didn't resist. Not yet. He knew that struggling would only fuel their excitement, their violence. They dragged him to the loading dock behind the cafeteria, where the large garbage compactor sat like a metal monster. It was used for crushing the day's trash, big enough to hold a person, with a powerful crushing mechanism and a heavy, airtight door. "Perfect," Caleb said, pulling out his phone to record. "Let's see just how lucky our little leprechaun really is." Ethan felt a strange calmness settling over him as they forced him toward the compactor. It was the same calm he had felt when the gunman came to his village, when he was forced to hide in the forest, when he saw his father die. The same calm he had learned to embrace to survive. They didn't know. They couldn't know. To them, he was just a skinny 16-year-old who was too afraid to fight back. They had no idea that he had witnessed horrors that would haunt their dreams, that he had learned to survive in a world where luck was a cruel joke. "Please," he said, his voice conveying just the right amount of fear, "please don't do this." It was what they wanted to hear. Caleb's grin widened, and he signaled Dustin and Ryan to open the compactor door. The foul smell of rotting garbage wafted out, and Ethan could see the crushed remnants of food and paper inside. "Don't worry, Paddy," Caleb said, positioning his phone to get the best angle. "We'll let you out in a few minutes, just long enough to see if that luck of the Irish is real." They shoved him inside, and the heavy door slammed shut with a deafening clang. Ethan heard the click of the external lock, heard their laughter echoing through the metal walls, heard Caleb telling everyone to be quiet so they could hear him begging to be let out. Then there was silence. Ethan stood in the darkness, breathing slowly and deeply. The smell was overwhelming, the air thick with the stench of decay. The crushing mechanism loomed above him, a symbol of the power his tormentors wielded. But Ethan didn't panic. He had been in worse places, much worse. He had spent days hiding in the cold, damp forests with nothing to eat and the constant fear of discovery. He had learned to control his fear, to focus his mind, to find strength in the face of despair. Outside, he could hear Caleb and his friends waiting, probably expecting him to start pounding on the door, screaming and pleading to be released. He could hear other students gathering, drawn by the excitement of seeing the weird Irish kid finally get what he deserved. But Ethan didn't pound on the door. He didn't scream or plead. Instead, he found a relatively clean spot against the back wall and sat down to wait. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Ethan could hear confused voices outside now, people wondering why he wasn't making any noise. Caleb was getting impatient, his voice carrying clearly through the metal walls. "Why isn't he saying anything?" Dustin asked, uncertainty in his voice. "Maybe he passed out," Ryan suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. "Nobody passes out that fast," Caleb said, but Ethan could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. 30 minutes, 40. The crowd outside was getting restless, and Ethan could hear teachers' voices now, adults who had noticed the commotion and were asking questions. Someone was arguing about whether they should open the door, but Caleb was insisting that they wait just a little longer. At the 50-minute mark, Ethan heard the sound he had been waiting for, the external lock clicking open. Light flooded the compactor as the door swung wide, and a dozen faces peered in, expecting to find a terrified, sobbing teenager begging for mercy. Instead, they found Ethan sitting calmly against the back wall, his breathing even, his color normal. There were no signs of distress at all. He looked up at them with those light green eyes and smiled faintly. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Is that all?" he asked, his voice ringing clearly in the sudden silence. "Back home, we call this a relaxing afternoon." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Caleb stumbled backward, his face paling. The other students began whispering, phones appearing to capture this impossible moment. Dustin and Ryan looked like they had seen a ghost. Ethan stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust off his clothes. As he walked toward the door, the crowd parted as if he carried a deadly disease. But he wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. "Caleb," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that made everyone freeze. "You wanted to know about my father, about why we left Ireland." Caleb seemed unable to speak. He just stood there staring at Ethan as if he were looking at something unnatural. "My father," Ethan continued, stepping closer, "was a peacemaker. He wrote about men who thought they were untouchable, men who thought they could kill without consequence. The men he wrote about didn't appreciate that." Another step closer. Caleb tried to retreat, but there were too many people behind him. "They killed him," Ethan said, his voice still conversational. "But first, they wanted to send a message. So they took his 12-year-old son, that would be me, and they showed him what happens to those who defy them. They wanted to break me, to make an example of what happens when you stand up to the wrong people." The silence was absolute. Even the teachers who had arrived to investigate had stopped talking, drawn in by the quiet intensity of Ethan's voice. "For years," Ethan continued, "I lived in a world of violence and fear. I learned things that no child should ever have to learn. I saw things that would haunt your dreams. And do you know what kept me going, Caleb?" Caleb shook his head, unable to speak. "The knowledge that someday, somewhere, there would be people like you. People who think that strength comes from hurting those who can't fight back. People who think that power means making others suffer." Ethan was close enough to touch Caleb now, close enough that everyone could see the difference between them. Caleb was bigger, stronger, supposedly tougher. But at that moment he looked like a frightened child compared to the pale, slight boy standing before him. "You want to see what I learned in those years, Caleb?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You want to find out what happens when you push someone who has already lost everything?" For a moment, it looked like Caleb might say yes. His pride was battling his growing fear, and Ethan could see the exact moment when fear won. I'm sorry," Caleb stammered, his voice cracking. It was just a joke, man. We didn't mean anything by it." Ethan studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know you didn't mean anything by it. That's the problem. You hurt people because you're bored, because it makes you feel important, because you can. That's what makes you dangerous, Caleb. Not your size, not your friends, not your family's money. Your indifference to other people's pain." He turned to address the entire crowd now, his voice ringing clearly in the afternoon air. "I came here to start over, to leave the violence behind. My grandfather made me promise to be better than the people who hurt my family. For weeks, I've kept that promise. I've let you mock me, humiliate me, hurt me, because I thought that was what being better meant." His light green eyes swept across the faces of his classmates, and several of them looked away. "But I was wrong. Being better doesn't mean being weak. It doesn't mean letting bullies do whatever they want, because fighting back might make you just like them. Sometimes being better means standing up even when it's hard." especially when it's hard. Ethan took a step back, giving Caleb some space, but his eyes never left the bigger boy's face. You have a choice to make, Caleb. All of you do. You can keep being the kind of people who hurt others for amusement, or you can choose to be better. But understand this, I'm done being your victim. I'm done being anyone's victim. The crowd began to disperse, teachers moving in to restore order, students drifting away in small groups, whispering among themselves. But Caleb remained frozen, staring at Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. "What are you?" Caleb whispered. Ethan considered the question. "I'm someone who survived a war zone so I could have a chance at a normal life. I'm someone who lost everything and came here hoping to find peace. I'm someone who's been pushed as far as he can be pushed." He paused, then added, "But mostly, I'm just a 16-year-old who wants to be left alone." As Ethan walked away, heading toward the front of the school where his grandfather would be waiting to pick him up, he could feel the weight of many eyes on his back. But it felt different now. Where before there had been dismissal and contempt, now there was something else. Respect, perhaps, or fear. He wasn't sure which he preferred. The following Monday, Northwood High felt different for Ethan Carter. Students who had never spoken to him before nodded as they passed him in the halls. Teachers looked at him with a new appreciation, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. And Caleb Johnson, the terror of the junior class, went out of his way to avoid eye contact. The story of what had happened at the compactor spread over the weekend, growing with each retelling. Some versions had Ethan meditating like a monk. Others had him dismantling the crushing mechanism with his bare hands. A few claimed he had been whistling Irish folk tunes the entire time. Ethan didn't bother to correct any of the stories. Let them think what they wanted. The important thing was that nobody was calling him Paddy anymore. At lunch, he sat in his usual corner, reading his book and eating his lunch. But this time, when someone approached his table, it wasn't Caleb or his gang. It was Olivia Reyes, a quiet girl from his English class who had always seemed as invisible as he had been. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Of course. Please." As she settled into her seat, she glanced around the lunchroom, noticing the way conversations quieted whenever people looked in their direction. "So," she said casually, opening her lunch bag, "Ireland, huh?" Ethan's lips twitched in a small smile. "That's right. I've heard it's beautiful there," she said. "It has its moments," Ethan said, thinking about the green hills and the grey skies. They ate in silence for a while, two invisible kids who had suddenly become very visible. Finally, Olivia spoke again. "You know, I always thought you seemed sad," she said. "Not scared, not angry, just sad." Ethan considered this. "I suppose I was. It's hard to leave everything behind and start over, especially when the things you left behind weren't your choice." "But you're not just sad, are you?" Olivia continued. "There's something else, something that Caleb and his friends never saw." "What do you think it is?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Olivia took a bite of her sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "Resilience, I guess. Not the kind that comes from muscles or a big mouth, but the kind that comes from surviving things that would break other people. The kind that lets you sit in a garbage compactor for almost an hour without flinching." "You think that makes me strong?" Ethan asked. "I think," Olivia said carefully, "that you're the strongest person in this school. Maybe the strongest person I've ever met, and I think you're also the loneliest." The observation struck Ethan harder than he expected. He had been so focused on keeping his head down, on avoiding trouble, that he hadn't realized how isolated he had become. Even before the incident with Caleb, he had been drifting through his days like a ghost, barely connecting with anyone or anything. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but I'm not sure I know how to be anything else." Maybe you don't have to figure it out all at once, Olivia suggested. Maybe you can start with just being yourself. The real you, not the version you think people want to see. As if summoned by their conversation, Caleb appeared at the edge of their table. But this wasn't the swaggering, confident bully who had tormented Ethan for weeks. This was a different Caleb, smaller somehow, less sure of himself. "Ethan," he said, his voice low enough that only they could hear. "Can I talk to you?" Ethan looked up at him, noting the way Caleb's hands shook slightly, the way he kept glancing around as if afraid someone might be watching. "Of course," Ethan said, gesturing to an empty chair. Caleb sat down carefully, as if expecting the chair to collapse. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Caleb cleared his throat. "I want to apologize," he said, the words tumbling out, "not just for the other day, but for everything. The names, the pushing, all of it. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Ethan studied Caleb's face, looking for signs of deception or insincerity. But all he saw was a 16-year-old who looked as lost and confused as Ethan felt most days. "Why?" Ethan asked simply. "Why what? Why did you do it? Why did you decide I was worth tormenting?" Caleb looked down at his hands, struggling to find the words. "I don't know. Because I could, I guess. Because you were different, and different was easy to pick on. Because it made me feel big. And now I can't stop thinking about what you said, about your father, about what happened to you, about what kind of person I am." Caleb looked up, meeting Ethan's eyes. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's a start." "I know an apology doesn't fix anything," Caleb continued. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to make it right somehow." "How?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, then straightened up with an effort. "I want to tell everyone the truth. About what really happened that day. About what I did to you. About what kind of person you really are." "And what kind of person am I?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious. "Someone who's been through hell and came out without becoming evil," Caleb said. "Someone who could have hurt me badly that day but didn't. Someone who's stronger than I ever thought possible." The sincerity in Caleb's voice was unmistakable, and Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly. That would take time, but something like understanding. "I accept your apology," Ethan said finally, "but it will take time to earn my trust." "I understand," Caleb said, relief in his voice. "I just thank you for not hurting me the way I hurt you." As Caleb stood to leave, he paused and looked back at Ethan. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you're here. I think this place needs someone like you." After he was gone, Olivia looked at Ethan with a new light. "That was remarkable," she said. "Most people in your situation would have wanted revenge." "Revenge is easy," Ethan replied, thinking of his grandfather's words. "Healing is the difficult part." The weeks that followed brought changes Ethan hadn't anticipated. Caleb, true to his word, worked to reverse the damage he had caused. He stopped his friends from harassing others, stood up to bullies, and volunteered with the school's conflict resolution program. Dustin and Ryan, deprived of their leader's approval, found their enthusiasm for bullying had diminished. They stayed away from Ethan and stopped targeting other vulnerable students. As for Ethan, he found that standing up for himself had opened doors. Students who had ignored him before began to include him in discussions, inviting him to study groups and asking for help with difficult subjects. He discovered that Olivia wasn't the only one who had been watching him from the sidelines. There were other quiet students, other outsiders who had recognized something in him long before the incident at the compactor. They formed a close group who met in the library during lunch to talk about books, music, and the world. Mrs. Davies, his history teacher, pulled him aside after class one day with an opportunity that surprised him. "Ethan," she said, "I've been thinking about you. I have a proposition." "Yes, Mrs. Davies." "I run a support group for struggling students, kids who are struggling with bullying, family troubles, things like that. I think you could be a real asset to the group. Your perspective, your experiences could help other students who are having a hard time." Ethan considered this. "What would I do?" "Just talk to them. Share your story if you're comfortable. Show them that it's possible to survive terrible things and become someone good." The idea was daunting. Ethan had spent so long hiding from his past that the idea of revealing it felt like stepping off a cliff. But maybe that was what he needed. "I'll think about it," he told Mrs. Davies. That evening, walking home from school, Ethan took a different route through town. The autumn air was cool, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. Lost in thought, he almost missed the commotion. A group of older kids had cornered a younger kid in the alley. Ethan could hear their taunts, could see the fear in the younger boy's eyes, and felt a familiar surge of anger. For a moment, he hesitated. It wasn't his problem. He had stood up for himself, had earned his peace. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything, continue on his path to a quiet life. But as he watched the older kids close in on their victim, he heard his grandfather's voice in his head, not warning him away from violence, but reminding him of something else. "A man must defend those who cannot defend themselves, lad." Ethan took a breath and stepped forward. "Hey," he called, his voice ringing in the air. "Leave him alone." The older kids turned, sizing him up. They saw what everyone saw, a slight, pale teenager who looked easily intimidated. "Mind your own business, kid," the largest one said, turning back. "It is my business," Ethan replied, moving closer. "Let him go." Something in his voice made them pause. It was the same quality that had stopped Caleb, the sound of someone who had nothing to lose. "You want to take his place?" one of them sneered, uncertainty in his voice. Ethan smiled, the same cold smile he had worn in the compactor. "If that's what it takes." The standoff lasted moments. Then, without understanding why, the older kids backed away. They muttered, but their hearts weren't in it. Something about the quiet teenager had unsettled them. After they were gone, Ethan helped the younger boy up. The kid couldn't have been 14, with the frightened look that Ethan knew well. "Thank you," the boy whispered. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Mike. Mike Hansen." "Mike Hansen, let me tell you about bullies. They're like wolves. They hunt the weak, but they run when someone stands up to them." Mike nodded, shaking. "You don't have to be a victim. You can choose to be stronger, not by fighting, but by refusing to let them break you." As Ethan walked away, leaving Mike in the dusk, he realized that Mrs. Davies had been right. His experiences had given him something valuable, the ability to recognize suffering and the knowledge to survive it. Maybe it was time to stop running and start building something new. The next day, he told Mrs. Davies he was ready to join the support group. It was time to stop being the victim and become the hero. Standing in the hallway of Northwood High, surrounded by teenage life, Ethan Carter understood what his grandfather had been teaching him. Strength wasn't about enduring suffering in silence. It wasn't about hiding from your past. Real strength was about taking the worst things that had happened and using them to make sure they didn't happen to someone else. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He was no longer a ghost, the invisible boy. He wasn't Paddy the victim or the Irish refugee. He was Ethan Carter, survivor and protector, ready to face whatever came next with the courage that came from having already survived the worst and chosen to remain human. Characters in the transformed text. Giant 33,004.